provided. The report builds on the scenario-based modeling approach of the previous groundswell report that was released in 2018, which covered Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. And both reports really reaffirm the potency of climate to drive migration within countries. This new report then seeks to set out and understand how climate-induced migration within countries, and particularly from slow onset climate change impacts, could play out in the next few decades, and what action areas we must pursue with this focus on the three new regions. It's really aimed to help policymakers to better plan and prepare for this likely movement of people within their countries due to climate change, and to understand areas of greatest vulnerability. So it was important in the approach for this study to go beyond individual events and media stories to assess how the escalation of climate change impacts could drive large-scale internal migration in the coming decades. And so the Groundswell report develops a scenario-based approach with plausible internal climate migration scenarios for slow onset climate factors up to 2050. And this is using state-of-the-art data from the IPCC, from the Intersectoral Impact Model Intercomparison Project, or ISIMIT project, and world population data. And this, combined with validation, grounding in the literature, and tailored assessments, these scenarios can inform policy, dialogue, and action. I want to note that we look at three main factors in our modeling approach. We focus on water availability, crop productivity, and sea level rise augmented by storm surge, because we know that these factors affect livelihoods and that they can reduce livability of certain areas, particularly in low and middle income countries. And so putting these together, we isolate out in the modeling the role of these climate factors to induce movement, compared to a counterfactual where there are no climate change impacts. And this gives us the scale of internal climate migration that I'll get into in a little bit. We outline three scenarios in our report. We have a pessimistic reference scenario, which is one with continued high greenhouse gas emissions and unequal development. And we compare this scenario with two alternative ones. A second one where we bring in more inclusive development, and a third one, which is our more climate-friendly scenario, where we meet the Paris Agreement targets. Now for some of the key findings and takeaways from the report. The first key takeaway is that the combined results across the 6 regions that we looked at in the report show that without early and concerted climate and development action, as many as 260 million people could move within their countries by 2050 as a consequence of slow onset climate change impacts. This is at the high end of our pessimistic reference scenario. It's important to note that the poorest and those living in the most climate vulnerable areas will be disproportionately impacted. And the report thus reaffirms the potency of climate change to induce internal migration as evidenced by the scale, trend, and patterns across the regions that we see. It's important to note that no region that we look at would be immune to these potential effects of internal climate migration. A second key takeaway is that locality matters critically. So internal climate migration is not uniform across countries or even within countries, and is going to depend on a combination of factors: demographic patterns, existing migration patterns, key livelihoods, and economic sectors. But climate is increasingly playing a role. And so we see that hotspots of internal climate migration could emerge as early as 2030 and continue to spread and intensify by 2050. And these hotspots can include areas with lower water availability, declining crop productivity, and from areas affected by sea level rise and storm surge. And so strategies and solutions are going to need to be tailored according to national and local contexts. And to examine this more closely in the report, we look at 3 sub-regions of focus: North Africa, the Lower Mekong, and Central Asia. And we also do 3 country case studies. We look at Morocco, Vietnam, and the Kyrgyz Republic. So let me give you an example from one of these. In the Lower Mekong and Vietnam, patterns of projected internal climate migration reflect the vulnerability to the impacts of sea level rise augmented by storm surge, particularly in densely populated low-lying coastal regions. And these host key livelihood systems, urban centers. And so we have project these areas by a combination, not just by sea level rise, but also declining water availability and crop productivity to 2050. And meanwhile, areas that are projected to have increases on both these factors are expected to become climate in-migration hotspots. These include the central coast of Vietnam, as well as Hanoi. However, these areas are themselves already impacted and exposed to extreme weather events, including flooding and cyclones. And so compounding impacts are a key consideration. So major coastal urban centers would thus require climate resilient planning, while early and concerted action would be needed to prepare key agricultural regions for climate change impacts, and in particular these low-lying areas. Vietnam is already working to address some of these climate change risks and stepping up these efforts, including proactive multi-sectoral planning and the adoption of transformative solutions. A third key takeaway of the report that I'd like to emphasize is that even if internal climate migration is going to be a reality, it does not have to become a crisis if we act now. Concerted action at the global level to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is an imperative to reduce the climate pressures that drive people to migrate. And at the same time, green, inclusive, and resilient development is critical for reducing the scale of internal climate migration and enabling countries to better plan and prepare. We find in the report that with that far-sighted and concrete climate and development action, that the scale of internal climate migration could be reduced by as much as 80% by 2050. But that window of opportunity is rapidly narrowing. So let me end and giving these findings on our policy recommendations in the report. So given our findings, there's this clear need for near, medium-term, and far-sighted strategies to help countries plan, anticipate, and prepare. And so the report outlines policy recommendations in 4 key areas. The first, as I said, on reducing global emissions and making every effort to meet the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. And this is to lessen the climate pressures and impacts that could drive people to migrate, particularly under conditions of distress. And beyond the cutting of emissions, our second recommendation, we emphasize equally the need to undertake development that is green, resilient, and inclusive. And so looking at the issue not just for today, but in the long term to plan ahead. And for example, this means building systems to be resilient, having livelihoods that are diversified so that people can move away from risk if needed and into areas of better conditions and prosperity. Our third recommendation is to really plan for each phase of migration. Migration as an adaptation strategy can result in positive development outcomes. And let me emphasize that this can be the case if it is well planned and well managed. And finally, a fourth recommendation around continuing to invest in better understanding of the drivers of climate migration. And this is really to inform well-targeted policies that are tailored to national and local contexts. So I hope with this gives you a good overview of our report and its findings, and I very much look forward to the discussion. So thank you very much for your attention, and back over to you, Professor Giordano.
Thank you, Viviane, Clement. Thank you to stick to the time we have. We are used to this international timeline, so I have not to intervene to urge you to finish your talk. So now we have Lorenzo Orioli. Please take the chair. Environment Office, Italian Agency for Development Cooperation. And his talk is about climate displacement, skills and tools. You can go there. Just there. Okay, thank you. Skills and tools for international cooperation. I know that Lorenzo Orioli has an anthropological and geographical background, and he also teaches environment policies at the University of Florence. So I think this talk will be affected for this view. Thank you, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Società Geografica Italiana, for this opportunity. So my speech, briefly, is about the link between skill and tools, recalling the title of this festival of Diplomazia. So we start from an assumption. In a relationship between climates and society, it's important to consider the migration as a form of mobility over a territory. In this sense, in nature, animal kingdom, vegetal kingdom, assuming the same concept of migration. This is a fact. This is not an unexpected phenomenon. Looking at the human migration through the glass of nature can help us to intersect the climate variability with the ecological behavior of biological communities. The human groups are part of this ecosystem, of these biological communities. In this way, we can propose an ecosystem approach to the climate displacement, in particular, where human groups are living in hotspot countries. Is this possible to design an holistic conceptual frame useful to face up to the new socio-environmental phenomena? The conceptual frame represent for us, for our cooperation, a skill, maybe a useful skill. The climate cycle rupture, the rupture of the seasonality, the rupture of rain distribution, plant phenology, is known by climate change. This fact produced the rupture of the cycle of migration at different geographical scales. The oscillating fields of these two cycles, migration and climatology, is expanding, and the ability to forecast by farmers, herders, and other people depending on ecosystem services is now reducing. The meteorological and ecophysiological phenomena in the past were recurrent over long periods. Today, they are impredictable and they have a stochastic regime. The migration cycle is interrupted by biological unlivability of environmental conditions from original territories. This fact concerns not only the human society, but also the other biological communities composing an ecosystem. The acceleration over time of this mechanism and their geographical expansion represent an example of unexpected phenomena. The irregular rain distribution delay, the increase of erratic precipitation causing disorientation among farmers and nomads. The better geographical scale explaining the so-called climatic potential of a society is a regional scale. This observation is a useful information also for international cooperation. Our initiative wants, in the same time, to be multi-stakeholders, multi-layer, multi-sectoral. Our initiative in Italian cooperation intersects in the same time the three Rio Conventions. In this way, we can make an integrated approach to the climate displacement. A unique socio-economic model of immigration is not able to explain pull and push mechanism linked to the climate displacement. For this reason, the climate displacement is forced migration. In this case, the balancing between the individual choice and external constraint hangs toward environmental factors, which create an unbearable life. Do you know, there are many people in Africa living in absolute temperature near to 40, 50 degrees, in a condition overcomes the tolerance limits for organisms, plants, animals, and human beings. About the climate-induced migration, our agency gives its contribution by the regulation, became secured migration by a good governance. The Italian Agency for Development Cooperation runs a network of 19 field offices for managing operation and initiative in partner countries worldwide. These field offices ranging from Central Asia to South and Latin America. In the countries where IX is working, the climate displacement is a well-represented phenomenon. For that, IX is setting up particular tools for the description of environmental context, like environmental countries profile, underlining its state of fragility of both ecosystem and political situation. Moreover, this tool will be used for evaluation of impact and monitoring of our action of development and humanitarian in our beneficiary countries. An example, in particular, in Somalia, Nigeria, and in the country around the Lake Chad, IX is working in multi-sectoral activities which are able to enforce the resilience of local communities and their adaptation, avoiding their displacement. On the basis of engagement in each field office of IX, is setting up a shared approach to climate displacements and our common operative tools. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lorenzo Orioli. And now we have Lawrence Hart, that is the Director, Coordination Office for the Mediterranean, International Organization for Migration. Please take the chair. And he'll talk about the engagement in migration, environment, and climate change. So please, Director, tell us about the position of IOM on all these important topics like climate change, migration, environment. Please.
Thank you, Professor Giordano.
Thank you.
Very good morning to all the present audience, and the people online. Thank you very much for the Festival della Diplomazia and the Società Geografica Italiana for hosting this very interesting event. I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion, a very contemporary discussion, because it is important to say that we have to start learning to live in an increasingly unstable world, and identifying islands of stability is what is actually our future challenge that awaits us. I think the pandemic, as well as climate change, has given us a very eloquent lesson about this. It's not a bad news, it's just a question of how we adapt to this situation. Humanity has adapted over time through many situations. It's just a question to be prepared. And this is a little bit the essence of what I would like to underline. IOM, as an international organization founded 70 years ago, became a UN agency in 2016, has increasingly invested and looked into climate migration in the last years, has recently appointed a special envoy. The Director General has appointed special envoys on climate and migration. I think if we have to summarize, and I will go into the detail, what the three main words, the three main verbs can be when we talk about climate change and migration is, and our position is to prepare, assist, and strengthen. And I will go into detail. But prepare is absolutely something that we need to focus on. Nowadays, I think the culture of prevention is still lacking. And when I say the culture of prevention is lacking, I would like to underline that most of the interventions that are funded are in response to a situation that has already happened. It's not about how can we strengthen the resilience, how can we prevent something happening. This is something that unfortunately is still probably not well ingrained. And I'm saying this, it's normal, because it's easier to repair something that is broken rather than to consolidate something that is not yet broken. So it's a question of mentality there that needs to take place. But let me go to say that in the context of a changing environment, people engage in different forms of migration within their countries and across borders. As we are all aware, environmental shocks and stresses have long been a factor shaping migration. This mobility spans from the continuum from displacement to more voluntary forms of migration. We heard some statistics, and I would like to underline them. For instance, in just this year, disasters accounted for 30.7 million new internal displacements in 149 countries, and more than 98% of these movements were the result of weather-related hazards. And as was mentioned by the World Bank, if no climate action is taken by 2050, climate change impacts could lead to a large number of people moving, ranging between 48 and 216 million people moving within their countries. And since 2015, significant progress has been made in integrating migration in the context of climate change and environmental degradation into key international frameworks and commitments, such as the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, the 2015 Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the 2015 Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Task Force on Displacement. These frameworks and instruments pave a way forward for an integrated approach that spans preventive action, humanitarian responses, and long-term sustainable recovery and development. They also point to the need to take action at the local, national, and regional levels, and in particular within at-risk and affected communities to avert, minimize, and address displacement and facilitate regular migration pathways in a changing climate. IOM has recently developed an IOM-wide institutional strategy on migration, climate change, and the environment, reflecting 25 years of experience in addressing the climate-environment-migration nexus. And this strategy outlines 3 key priorities for IOM in the next decade, so from 2021 to 2030. First and foremost, to develop solutions for people to move by managing migration and promoting approaches facilitating orderly, safe, responsible, and regular migration in a changing climate. What does that mean? I go back to my first verb, to prepare. So how can we actually know what is going to happen in a remote island rather than in a city in Latin America that is going to disappear because of the ocean level rising? We need to prepare that. We need to know that a city, for example, having 40,000 inhabitants will disappear in 20 years. We need to take action and know how to relocate these people. This is just an example. There are many more. So prepare. But also, the second point of the strategy is to develop solutions for people on the move by assisting and protecting migrants and displaced persons through anticipatory actions, life-saving aid, and right-based approaches. Meaning that there are already people on the move as a result of climate change. Whether they are internally displaced or whether they're international migrants, this is something that we need to factor as well. So how do we assist these people? How do we make sure that they get the right level of assistance and protection? And finally, to develop solutions for people to stay. by building resilience and addressing the adverse effects of climate change and environmental degradation that compel them to move or attract new residents that can contribute to adaptation and to boost community resilience. So it's not all doom and gloom. It's about also helping people to stay where they are because they have a livelihood. They are ingrained, rooted in where they are. Can we make sure that these communities can be, that the resilience of this community can be strengthened over time in order to enable them to stay where they are? So that the third verb was exactly to strengthen. Now, indeed, migration is not only a consequence of climate change impacts, but it also has an aspect of climate change adaptation when and if enabling conditions are in place. In 2010, the UNFCCC's Cancun Adaptation Framework explicitly recognized migration as a form of adaptation that should be included in countries' long-term adaptation planning. In fact, migration affects and is affected by climate change. Climate impacts affect people's voluntary or forced mobility in the context of slow and sudden onset disaster. Similarly, climate change and environmental degradation affect natural resource-dependent livelihoods, for example, farming, fishing, pastoralism, which in turn influence food security and human mobility. These effects are tangible, irrespective of the country's level of income or geopolitical classification. However, conventional approaches to the migration, environment, and climate change nexus tend to focus on the global south, often conceiving of migration as a consequence of climate change, following a root cause approach to migration policy and practice. Yet, the extent to which safe, regular, and dignified migration can become an adaptation and mitigation strategy is less well understood and considered in policy and practice on adaptation and on sustainable development in the global north. IOM has been recently engaging in better understanding the transformative potential of migration and adaptation and building resilience of fragile mountainous areas in Italy. And I'm coming down from the global to the Italian context, which is important also to talk about Italy. Italy's national climate change adaptation strategies identifies the Alps and the Apennines as fragile areas where the impacts of climate change are expected to be strongly felt. These areas face environmental challenges such as high climate variability, as well as social, economic, and demographic vulnerabilities. Not only these territories are distant from major service hubs, but are also characterized by population aging, depopulation, and economic decline. In some cases, the reception model and labor market needs have driven the settlement of migrant communities in such areas. In turn, this presence has contributed to the preservation of the natural and cultural heritage of these areas. Also, the revitalization of local economies and workforce regeneration, besides mitigating the impacts of emigration, population aging, and decline by fostering demand for the maintenance of local basic services such as education, healthcare, and transportation in areas with low population density. It's very interesting. This we can open up really a long discussion. We were participating in a panel where experts have actually looked into how these depopulating area can become an opportunity for the migrant population. Now, to better understand such dynamics and how local planning can consider migration and adaptation and other local development strategies, IOM will commission a study which aims at exploring migrants' contributions in addressing climate change challenges in these fragile areas and will publish the findings in late March 2022. And I'm coming to the end. Thank you for your patience. IOM therefore conceives of migration as an integral part of preparedness, adaptation, and overall sustainable development worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director. Thank you, Director, for your speech. Now we have to connect remote with Modo, if you are ready. Director. That is Director Roma Center for Sustainable Development, Natural. I was not opening the mic, sorry. So thank you, Director. Now we have to connect with Musonda Mumba. I think she's connecting remote. And Musonda Mumba is Director of Rome Center for Sustainable Development, Nature, Climate and Energy. And she's a UN diplomat at the United Nations Development Program. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Okay, so Mrs. Musonda, please give us a context in work. You were involved in this kind of opportunities and the work you are doing with the Roma Center and the UNDP. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Giordano. I'm deeply grateful for this invitation and to be in a room with fellow geographers, because I did study in the geography department of University College London. I think the previous speakers really put into context a lot of the elements that I was going to mention, particularly from the political side, but I also want to really go back a little bit because I want to talk about the intersection of climate change, environment, and migration in a post-pandemic world. And I'll be fairly brief because a lot of points have been highlighted, and give perhaps, you know, an example from a pre-COVID world and how in the present times we've been learning from these experiences. In my past work, when I used to work for UN Environment, and lovely to see Mr. Hart there from IOM, in 2008, we designed a program called Security in Mobility, together with IOM, Institute for Security Studies, UNEP, UNDP, and to really look at the mobility of migratory communities within the Horn of Africa. Now, when I asked a friend of mine who sat in the Kenyan government in parliament, and I said, when you see Maasai people, other communities go across the borders, particularly without mentioning the word drought, to take their animals, to find water, what do you think? And her instant response for somebody who sits within legislation was small arms. So now here's a moment where you have to see the intersection between the political dynamic, issues of security, but also the overlap of climate change in these dynamics. And so through this work, we really began to show within the East African community to really understand and also get an understanding of why it's important at the political level, particularly at the legislative level, to have conversations, especially within the East Africa community, because there's an East Africa Community Parliament in this regional economic body, to talk about the issue of climate change as it intersections with other issues and challenges. Now, what we've been doing and working on from the UNDP side, and as you're very well aware, we have over 47 offices across the African continent and present as UNDP in over 150 countries around the world. Now, I'll contextualize this to Africa, even though I've done a lot of work in Latin America, Asia, and Europe. And some of the work is to really realize the dynamics of migration as it impacts women. Because what we've also noticed in many parts, particularly the Sahel, is the implications and complexities of the remaining within these societies. And more recently, in 2019, I set up a network called the Network of African Women Environmentalists to really bring the faceless and give them a face in relation to how do we talk about those women that remain in communities that have been basically have most of their men and youth leaving due to migration. In a more recent experience, I spoke with some indigenous women in Chad region, and I heard a colleague mention Chad there, and we spoke to them about the role of non-state actors. And so at the policy level, it's important to recognize and remember that a lot of these constituencies also exist within these structural systems that represent non-state actors. And these non-state actors can be in the form of royal houses, local leadership, as it were, youth voices, etc. Now, more recently in this post-pandemic world, we have seen how around Lake Chad, a region that's been shrinking, and obviously where we've seen historical conflict, most of it related to the climate change dynamic and also the mobility within and outside of this region. We have also seen very recently, as recent as a few months ago, how local leadership have actually been involved in talking about how do we curb and deal with the issue of migration. So as you can imagine, they brought together not just the pastoralists, but also the sedentary communities that grow their food within these spaces to talk about a mechanism or a resolution of sorts to actually curb this localized violence, particularly as it relates to the transhuman dynamic. And it was very interesting because our counterparts within UNDP, in Cameroon, in Nigeria, and Chad region have been really discussing these discussions, particularly as recent as last week, to really find out a way. And I really liked Mr. Filippo's message there about the geography of vulnerability and also the geography of responsibility. So lastly, but not the least, as we're transitioning and moving towards this green recovery, what does this actually mean, particularly from the interest with Italy, who are our hosts, the Minister of Ecological Transition? 2 weeks ago, there was a meeting in Rome in the margins of the Africa Encounters Summit organized by MITRE, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, which was absolutely brilliant and necessary to have in this post-pandemic world, with a focus on energy and the Sahel, and also the intersection of climate change. And so what we begin to see now more often than ever is how can we find solutions, particularly for the communities that are potentially migrating, and also for the sedentary communities, the women and youth that are being left behind. So I'll give 4 pointers based on what is called the Network of African Women Environmentalist 4-point agenda for action. And this agenda is really looking at the issue of data. A lot of people are coming from very degraded locations. And us as UNDP and the Rome Center in particular, we're part of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. A lot of people are leaving these spaces that are degraded and leaving spaces where there are no opportunities. How do we understand and how do we activate the element of data revolution, making sure that women understand their complexities and also their numbers accounted within their localized and political systems? Let's talk about an uptake of technology and innovation. It was really good to see a lot of Italian-based constituencies, companies really talking about how do we support climate-smart agriculture from an innovation and technological perspective, especially for women, but also looking at this energy element, which is very, very important because part of the reason these challenges have manifested is the absence of green jobs, which we know for certain. And then thirdly is this advancing the financial inclusion. A lot of times we have not included women in the conversation of agricultural value chains and also young people in this inclusivity. Unfortunately, in many parts of Africa, including Kenya, where I am at present, is you walk into a bank and you see some pink balloons in a corner, product for women, and they've never been included in the conversation in this financial inclusivity. And as such, when they've been left in these pockets and spaces to adapt to these complexities, they have no idea how to go about it. So how do we make sure that we accelerate and advance this financial inclusivity, but also align it within a way that it's aligned with the green recovery, as really flagged very much within the agenda of Italy? Lastly, but not the least, how do we aggregate human capital for green jobs and make sure, as I mentioned in the Chad case, that indigenous knowledge systems are stronger more than ever and included in a lot of the decisions, and some that were referenced to by Mr. Hart there, in terms of how do we prepare people to adapt, but also how do we deal with these agroecological and fragile ecosystems that trigger migration, as it were. Lastly, but not the least, I just want to really mention a bit of an anecdote because I'm a visiting fellow of the Perry World House of the University of Pennsylvania, and I was speaking last year just in the margins of the pandemic and flagged very much an issue that's been mentioned by the previous speakers, that there are challenges both in the global north and in the global south. We've seen what fires in California have done. And now the US also contending with that internal migration of people moving away from these fragile ecosystems where we're seeing fires intensifying, smoke, bringing in and compounding all these elements of climate change, as it were. And I think this is where the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030 in particular comes into necessity, because ultimately we need not leave no one behind. And it is important that even as we discuss in this session, we really talk about within the context of this Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals and why they matter in this discourse on climate and migration diplomacy. Thank you so very much for having me, and over to you.
Thank you. Musonda Mumba, thank you also for this intervention on climate change and migration in post-pandemic world. Now, talking about Africa, we have Giuseppe Mistretta, the ambassador, is director for Sub-Saharan Africa, Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, and I know, please take the chair, and I know he will talk about the marginalization and the process of disintegration of states, African states, from a political point of view, but also later as a migratory and security issue. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you, Professor Giordano. Thank you to the Società Geografica for inviting me. It's always a pleasure. This is not the first time that I come as a guest. And thank you to the other guests who spoke before me. With the only problem that now they have said all, and now the left part for me is very, very minimal. So I will stay within the 8 minutes, I believe. I would like really, as you mentioned, Professor, to give a political point of view, political with maybe the big P. You know that a few days ago we organized in Rome Incontri con l'Africa. It's our biannual event with all the countries of Africa to talk about subjects, an update of our bilateral relation with all the states of Africa. Well, this year, Incontri con l'Africa, which is a new name, was concentrated exactly on the consequence, political, economic, on the migration issues of the climate change, and the link between climate change and transitional energy. I mean, the problem of a difference in the use of energy, also in Africa. Why we did that, apart from the fact that we were very satisfied to have a different conference, very interactive, modern, much better than in the past. And I can say it because I also organized the previous one. Because we had, first of all, 35 ministers coming, 33 ministers plus 2 vice ministers, plus African Union, Moussa Faki was there, Vera Songwe, who is a very big name in Africa, came from UNECA. UNECA is the Economic Commission for Africa. And why we did this? Because Italy is, in this moment, at the same time, is president of the G20 countries up to the end of the year, and co-president, partner, you name it, in the COP23 process. So before these big events, Glasgow and Rome, we will have at the end of October the summit of the G20 countries, we wanted to hear the voice of Africa. We imagined that it was important to prepare ourselves as president of G20 and co-president of the COP26 to hear the voice of Africa. It's very interesting because it's not very usual to really understand what Africa wants to say about this subject. And I repeat, the subjects were two, interconnected: climate change in Africa and transitional energy, because they are in connection, these two elements. Well, if I can refer a moment also to you about the result of this debate, which was 1.5 days long, it's very interesting because, of course, maybe you know already, Africa doesn't consider itself responsible for the climate change. They are subject, they are suffering the consequence of the climate change a lot. But of course, if tomorrow we minimize or abolish oil, gas, and all the other energy resources coming from Africa, the contribution to the climate change or the responsibility of Africa in this respect would be 0.0001. So, and this was very much underlined by our partners. They said, okay, we contribute, we are all in the same boat, but we are not responsible for this. So the countermeasure should be common, but the responsibilities should be differentiated. So we are not all responsible in the same way. This is important to understand. The second point that they mention is that we make money with these resources. I mean, the resources that you want to abolish or to reduce, such as oil, gas, carbon, etc., are exactly the resources that permit us to live, that are the main contribution that we receive from the Western countries, the rich countries, etc. So if tomorrow you cut the orders about oil, gas, etc., altogether, our country goes bankrupt. And so this phenomena of migration, poverty, and the refugees and displaced people, instead of reducing, they will increase. So keep this in mind. And this was very useful to understand. So especially for the gas sector, all the countries such as Mozambique, Angola, and Algeria, the big producers, said gas should remain as a transitional energy, because if we stop the production and the sale of gas and other hydrocarbons, really the economy can go bankrupt, and this is not what we want. So I consider this important to make you aware of this message, which is important in the perspective of the G20 summit and the COP26. Now, I have to say, I might say many other things, but I want to respect the 8 minutes. In my opinion, I am a senior official. Of course, I'm not a free thinker. I depend on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But I observed that the awareness in Europe, in Africa, about the climate change, the crisis, the terrible perspective, outlook for the future is there. I mean, there is awareness. In our Western countries, and especially I talk about Italy and about Europe, European Union, there is not the same awareness about migration and all the other consequences. So while we have COP26, we don't have a COP26 about the problem of migration, and which are, of course, in direct relation, in direct consequence on climate change. This is not two separated worlds. They are very much interconnected worlds. So let's hope that for the future, the effort of Italy is there. I mean, we continuously try to focus in the European environment about our responsibility should be shared, should be common. We are not alone. We should not be left alone. But, of course, you know what happens in the European environment. So, and then, of course, we can talk later on other, because this is just half of the topics that I would like to touch upon, but I want to respect the 8, let's say, 10 minutes. So thank a lot for your attention. Grazie, Professor.
Thank you, Ambassador, to stick to the time. I just received on my mobile your presentation book in Louis next Tuesday on your Africa pathways, just talking about Africa. So congratulations for your book. Anyway, now we have the next speaker, that is, which is Massimo Pronio, please. That is the head of communication representation of the European Commission in Italy, and they will talk about the Geneva perspective. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Giordano. Good morning, everyone. I have discussed with Giorgio Bartolomucci a couple of months ago about this meeting, and I said, I have taken up service in Rome the 1st of September after 3 years in Geneva. So in Geneva, a lot of what is being discussed is climate displacement. So do we have an event on climate displacement? And Giorgio replied to me, yes, we are doing one at the Italian Geographical Society. So I said, it would be a pleasure to intervene, also because I saw in the next room a bust of my former geography professor at the University of Genoa, Professor Ferro. So thanks for the invitation. I served 3 years in Geneva with the European External Action Service. Before I served also in Angola, a very important country that Ambassador Mistretto, of course, mentioned. And I have a special attention and worked many years on African issues. What I found in Geneva when I joined the EU delegation to the United Nations was that I follow mainly migration and refugees. So I follow mainly the work of IOM, of Director General Vittorino, who is also former EU Commissioner, and of High Commissioner Grandi of Refugees, UNHCR. So I saw that in Geneva there was a specific attention due to the attention of Switzerland given to the Nansen Initiative and the Sendai Framework for to disaster displacement. And there was a platform for disaster displacement, the PDD. This platform, which was created some years ago, is a state-led initiative where the EU was only an observer, and started by Norway and Switzerland, and then by many other countries who have taken the rotating presidency, countries which have had either the vision to see what was going on in the world, or they were suffering directly the problem. So you had countries like Nordic countries or Switzerland, or other countries like Bangladesh or Fiji. So now the presidency is with Fiji, and the vice presidency is with France, which has always showed a very big attention to this problem. And the EU will take up the vice presidency next 1st of January. So what this platform has standing invitees like the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the IOM. And now they will take on board also the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Agency. But Lawrence Hart mentioned Caroline Dumas, the new special envoy, the Director General Vittorino nominated for climate action. But before Madame Dumas, there was also Andrew Harper that UNHCR mentioned. So we see that in Geneva, what we see in Geneva very often is what is coming after and is being brought to general attention. And so we saw that these big UN agencies, which work on human mobility, in fact, and protection, they have both nominated special envoys for climate, UNHCR first and then also IOM. So there is a specific attention to this climate displacement topic. As our colleague from the World Bank said initially, I think a lot of the initial attention was given to disaster displacement. So if there was a hurricane but as the World Bank correctly underlined in the first intervention, the slow onset are very much important. I think also Lawrence repeated this. Because slowly, we see that people move because of climate change, because very often rural population, they do not find, as our colleague from the International Italian Cooperation Agency underlined, we see that people move because they cannot find agricultural land at disposals anymore. So in Italy, in Europe, we always see the eyes of the migration, invasion of migration, which for me is a very misinterpreted topic. There is a lot of this general disinformation in the public opinion. I think there are people on the move. I think big movements of people, we can see them in Lebanon, in Jordan, where half of the population at some times was due to the influx of Syrian refugees. But in other parts, considering a European population of 500 million, the number of migrants is still very minimal. Instead, the climate movement is a different kind of movement. And what I saw in Geneva, and I understood in these 3 years of working closely with IOM and UNHCR, is that people, they because they move because of climate displacement, but they do not necessarily migrate, you know. So I appreciate very much the efforts that IOM is changing its role from originally very humanitarian project-based agency to an agency which is now working more on anticipation, on prevention, and but I think a lot of the climate displacements that we see now are people who move because, for instance, the land is dry. They move to a couple of hundred kilometers towards a river. So I think this is very important, climate displacement, to keep in mind this kind of movement. So what is the EU doing? Okay, at the Geneva level, we will take up this presidency, this vice presidency and then presidency, hopefully next year, after the vice presidency. And we have taken out the Green Deal, because even if Europe is one of the countries with the lowest emission, Europe has taken the challenge of bringing the emission as low as possible, and also to lead by example. I think Ambassador Mistretta said we can do something, but we cannot control what the others are doing. So there are also other big countries that should take a bit the situation of emission under control, and that will reduce the climate deterioration and the climate displacement also. So I have finished. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pronio, and thank you also for this intervention that is also a kind of a gathering of the other interventions, so we have a kind of resume of the other intervention. So now we have more or less 20 minutes. I will use these minutes just from some comments on your intervention and some reactions. For example, I would like to ask you, Lawrence Hart, what IOM is doing with these keywords of assist after to prepare, especially for the IDPs and more for the trapped population. Population cannot move because we don't know so much about this. So this population that they cannot move, and I think your intervention in this country is not so very easy because, of course, these are trapped in their country. Sometimes the government of these countries are responsible for the movement of these people. Can you tell us something about this? Yes, if you want.
No, it's just for the, I don't know if they can hear us if I speak. It's up. Yeah.
There.
Thank you. I thank you for the question. And again, I would like to reiterate, this has been a very interesting exchange with all the speakers. I think very, very complimentary items came about. So when we talk about assistance, obviously on people of the move, there is a lot of actions that can be taken. Obviously, the assistance depends also on the category of migrants, and here we open up another larger basket. So who are the migrants nowadays? There are men, but not only men, there are women, there are unaccompanied minors, and among women are there victims of trafficking. So in each of these cases, it's important to be equipped and understand how we assist each in these categories of people that come about on people on the move. Now, when it comes to assisting people to stay, I can just bring one example, but there are many more that I've been personally exposed to. I was serving in Afghanistan before arriving in Rome, and Afghanistan is an icon of a country of very fragile environmental context. So there is a war, there is a conflict, but let's see that is a country where we have witnessed an enormous amount of people internally displaced, up to almost 5 million people, 4.5 if I'm not mistaken, the latest, due to internal conflict, but also to fragility of the context. And there are some, you would be surprised, there are some very cost-effective measures that can be adopted to stabilize population. It's not, sometimes it's very complex. I'm not saying that you can always have shortcuts. One of the elements that was interesting was the construction of infrastructure to allow communities to continue in the livelihoods in, for example, cultivating fruit or vegetables or whatever it was. But also what was interesting, IOM was involved in empowering the communities to build some gabion walls, which are these walls made of stones and with a iron, how you say, cover and mix. And that it was very interesting because IOM was not building the walls. It was actually teaching or lending the expertise of how the community could build the walls and maintain those walls. And the interesting thing was not just about preserving the community, it was about access for the children to go to school. So I was approached by a teacher who told us, we're very grateful because, our kids can go to school. And that's powerful because if you think about it, education is something that is fundamental in certain societies if we want to ensure. Yeah. I don't know if I answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you. You were mentioning also education of women. Now, I would like to speak to you. We have still in connection remote our friends Musonda Mumba. Sorry, I forgot the mic. So I was telling about the education woman, the empowerment of women. I will ask also something to Musonda Mumba if she still is in connection, okay? So which is the role of education for women in preventing this kind of climate displacement?
No, thank you very much for that question. I'm going to give an example on some of the work that I was involved in historically, particularly with the Maasai community. As you know, most of the indigenous peoples in the Horn of Africa are migratory. And so what was quite important in that program that I mentioned on the security and mobility that we worked together with IOM and other partners was very much how do we also educate a community that has traditionally and for many years been a migratory, has a migratory pattern. And so what was very interesting is also how they are received within specific communities where they historically don't live. And what we've seen within Kenya, for example, is how the Maasai communities in Kajiado live in close proximity with the indigenous Kikuyu communities. And it was very interesting because when we asked the women about what they thought were the solutions for them and why they mattered, they were like, look, we've been moving for many times and our children are not getting an education. And so we have opted to actually learn ways of agriculture and other agroecological mechanisms to be able to survive, but also to get an income. So as you can imagine, this also gave a level of stability to their children so they could be able to go to school and get a level of education. And so what we've seen with the pandemic, together with the intersection of climate change and really touching a little bit on the conversation from Ambassador Mistretta, very much the conversation of 2 weeks ago with the Africa Encounters is the issue of energy. We have seen nearly 9.8 million children out of school on the African continent. So what does that mean? And most of this is really, how do you make a decision of whether you can go to school or there's even possibilities for food because you need to cook, or the options are fuel wood. And if there's no fuel wood, are there any other options? So how do we make sure that these elements of educating resident communities happen in a very systematic way? And so this is something that is very critical to the agenda of UNDP and how we support these countries and how we support them at the micro level and macro level from a political perspective to make sure that these, these needs are being met. But also it's not just UNDP, it's UNDP working in close collaboration with UNHCR, with working in close collaboration with IOM and other civil society groups and also traditional and non-traditional non-state actors as well. Over.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Musonda. I'm just trying to connecting all the speech, and you just mentioned energy transition. That is the issue about Mistret talk about how we can combine energy transition with sustainability of societies, not only environmental societies. And so this is an issue, and we are also paying now some costs for the energy transition. So how we can combine, please, energy transition with sustainability? I'm referring to sustainability of societies, not completely environmental sustainability, because energy transition is an issue. As you said, we change something in the societies.
Yes, thank you. This introduces us to a theme in which I'm not an expert because I'm the director for Africa, but not about environment.
Okay.
But this introduces us to the big question, the big issue of adaptation. The African countries can change the system of energy, can change the resources, but should be assisted. Yesterday, our Prime Minister Draghi said something related to us, but can be transferred exactly on the international level. He said all this big transition, digitalization, energy, etc., must be assisted by the state, because if we want that by itself, the world changes thanks to the industries, thanks to the finance, etc., independently, we never have the solution to this problem. So we need to assist. At the same time, mutatis mutandis, of course, the problem of adaptation in Africa for energy transition is exactly this. And it will be brought at the table in Glasgow. If you want to change the energy, if you want to introduce the energy transition, so the green agenda, the green energy, solar, aeolic, etc., there must be some financial contribution, important, huge financial contribution. In a moment in which Africa, but I don't introduce this subject now because it's too difficult, also under a technical point of view, in a moment in which Africa has very little liquidity. Africa doesn't have a BCE, a central bank that can acquire, can purchase obligations, and obligations is not is the shares, let's say, and give liquidity to the system. So the liquidity of the system can only be received by the International Monetary Fund through the special depository special drawings, you understood, SDR. But this is a very difficult issue in which I really don't want to enter now. But just to say that adaptation must be paid, sustained, supported by the Western countries and by the rich world. This is, I think, is the answer to your question.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. And again on Africa, if we can connect with Viviane Clement, again, she's still there in remote.
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, thank you. You coordinated this great report. I just gave a look, and you talk also about North Africa. Can you tell us something about North Africa, how the transition is there, how the climate change and the relation with the migration is there? Because this is really important for geographical reasons, for proximity with Europe. So which are the findings of your report on North Africa?
Absolutely, and thank you for that question. And just to say, it was so insightful to hear the perspectives from the different panelists and bringing this all together. Yes, indeed, like you mentioned, North Africa was one of our sub-regions of focus, and we have a case study on Morocco in particular. And I think what is interesting and important to draw out between these different sub-regions of focus that we look at, again, is to reemphasize this message that locality matters critically, right? So how climate change impacts are going to play out in a given national context and given local context are going to be quite different across the different countries. I mentioned to you, the example of Vietnam previously in terms of, impacts on sea level rise, in terms of low-lying areas that host key agricultural systems. The story is different in North Africa, where really it's one about water scarcity and how that factor, in particular water stress increasing to 2050, is going to be a key factor in the mix of drivers that would induce people to move within their countries. So, in the case of North Africa and of Morocco in particular, we see, for example, certain inland areas, being affected increasingly by water scarcity. And that this would, spur movement towards, in particular, climate in migration hotspots that we identify in the sub-region that are really coastal urban centers that are themselves already growing and expanding in population and are already destinations for many rural to urban migrants, in particular the youth. So in the case of North Africa, it's this dynamic around water scarcity that is sort of amplifying, I guess, some of the existing migration trends from rural to urban areas, in particular growing coastal urban centers. Of course, in the context of the low-lying Nile Delta, we do see the impacts related to a sea level rise and identify that as a climate outmigration hotspot. But this is to say, and maybe to echo what some of the fellow panelists said, that this really puts the focus on what are some of the solutions in national and local contexts that can be taken. In the context of Morocco and North Africa, this focus on long-term strategies in terms of managing and developing water resources in the long term really have come out as key, and how to prepare key agricultural regions using technologies and climate smart agriculture interventions, as was mentioned before, would also be key. But alongside this, are some of these, low carbon and resilient, sort of economic transformations across key areas and sectors that are, more of the sort of medium to long-term aspects that are important to keep in mind. The importance of, climate smart urban transitions in particular, as to highlight over here. Because urban centers in the context of the report play an important role, both as climate in migration and out migration hotspots. And so when we're talking about spurring the new generations of skills and jobs, what does that mean in the context of urban centers and the green job agenda? When we look at climate resilient urban planning, what does that mean in terms of differentiated vulnerabilities and in terms of regional and national contexts? So hopefully that gives you some light on the results for North Africa, but also tying into some of the near-term and longer-term planning solutions that we would need to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect. The highlight was perfect, and I invite people, the audience, to read also this incredible and very well-made report by the World Bank. So now we have still 10 minutes, and if you don't mind, the Massimo Proni or Lorenzo Rioli, I will leave you for last intervention, and we make a change now with some questions from the audience here in the hall or at home. We don't know if we have some question from home. No. Okay, we have questions here from the audience to the speakers or some intervention, but very briefly intervention, please. I know Professor Paratore wants to intervene. Yes, of course you can, but please be very, very short. We have few time. We have just
allora,
5 minutes. We have.
Uno dei difetti della vita mia, io mi chiamo Emanuele Paratore, sono laureato. Uno dei difetti della vita mia, purtroppo io l'inglese lo traduco, ma non lo so né parlare né capire, quindi non ho capito nulla di quello che è stato detto oggi. Però ci tenevo a essere presente. Io sono laureato in scienze geologiche alla Sapienza. Ho insegnato come professore ordinario di geografia sia all'Università di Cagliari che a Roma La Sapienza, nella facoltà di lettere, dove fra l'altro sono stato preside per 10 anni della facoltà di lettere. Tra l'altro ho l'onore di essere stato 30 anni fa anche consigliere della Società Geografica Italiana. Quindi credo che volevo fare questo intervento, non ho capito nulla quello che è stato detto, però sicuramente il mio intervento, quando l'ho raccontato a mia moglie stamattina, mi ha detto sarai fischiato, fischiatemi pure, sono molto contento. Io mi dispiace, ma sono una di quelle poche persone che crede di capirci qualcosa anche sul clima, che è contrario, una delle pochissime persone che è contraria a quello che si dice oggi, e cioè che il clima è influenzato dalle porcherie che fa l'uomo sulla terra. Ora che vicino alle industrie o l'inverno, quando si mettono le porcherie dei riscaldamenti, l'uomo possa, anche se per me non è così, possa respirare dell'aria che è inquinata, questo è normalissimo, che l'uomo nelle città viva in mezzo alla M, e avete capito che voglio dire, questo è normale. Ma il fatto che si dica che le emissioni dell'uomo influenzano il clima, per me è una grande, enorme fesseria, una cosa che non esiste al mondo, che le porcherie, il clima è una dimensione che non c'entra niente con le schifezze umane. Che ci sia un periodo di riscaldamento oggi è la cosa più naturale che possa esistere al mondo. Di periodi caldi e freddi nella storia della Terra se ne sono alternati miliardi di volte. Al tempo dei dinosauri faceva molto, ma molto più caldo di adesso. Al tempo dei dinosauri non c'erano le calotte glaciali. Il Sahara, e questo lo sanno benissimo tanti scienziati, è stato pascolato, era ricco di foreste. La Groenlandia, il nome stesso lo dice che è stata Greenland, e non vi devo ovviamente tradurre questa parola. Cioè, voglio dire, nella storia della Terra il clima ne ha combinate di tutti i colori. In epoca greca e romana, per parlare ovviamente in epoca in cui non c'erano...
Professore,
ovviamente,
però adesso devo interrompere.
che dici?
Il concetto è chiaro.
Che ci siano state alternanze di caldi e freddi è una cosa normalissima. Che l'epoca romana greca ci siano stati degli eventi atmosferici eclatanti è una cosa normalissima. Il clima è una cosa che ne ha combinate di tutti i colori nella storia della Terra. Io non posso parlare, comunque penso che quello che voglio dire
è molto chiaro il suo concetto,
si sia compreso.
Assolutamente.
Ovviamente,
grazie
benissimo.
professore, grazie.
Ci tenevo a fare questo intervento.
Grazie, grazie professore. So let's continue in English now with I will ask to Lorenzo Rioli if you have some reaction to the previous speech, or you want to add something, because yours was very large intervention. So, of course, please. Yeah.
It's an observation, but in the same time is a question. For me, personally, there is a limit to the adaptation. Adaptation is a biological term. For adaptation, it's necessary to have a long period of time, okay? In this preparation step, what is the tools for make an adaptation? For me, not everywhere it's possible to make adaptation measure. Not for all migrant people, it's possible to put on adaptation strategy. So my question is how to distinguish different regional area, geographical area, to optimize adaptation strategies for considering ecosystem and people living inside. Thank you.
Please, Director.
Thank you, Mr. Rioli. I think your question is very. I fully agree. I fully agree that we cannot make all the world adapt to the situation or strengthen the resilience. There are obviously various elements that we need to factor when we talk about strengthening the resilience. First and foremost, it's identifying how these communities are linked to services, how these communities are also linked to economic opportunities. For example, are the communities in the proximity of a possible large mining situation, mining context, just to give an example. Is then that possible to strengthen the resilience because of climate in that specific context? So there are, it's a complex answer, but to give a sort of very focused reply, you need to factor various elements, and I fully agree with you. It's not just about climate, it's also about what is there also to harness on and to exploit. So indeed, you need to devise a comprehensive plan, I would say, with a variety of expertise, people who understand about geology, but people who also understand economy.
Thank you, and I would like now, we are running out of the time, so I will abdicate to my role of chair, and I will give the floor to Massimo Pronio, that is very good in gathering all the intervention as a head of the communication of the representation of the European Commission in Italy. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor. Well, I think it was an interesting and lively also discussion. We heard a lot of different point of views. And what can I say from the European Union perspective is that we try to be there. We try to be there, and I have seen that we had Commissioner Timmermans in Milano last week, and we saw that all actors, also in the UN arena, in the multilateral world, are trying to be present with their message, also for the Conference on Climate, which will be held in Glasgow. I think the Special Envoy on Climate, which I mentioned before from IOM, her role will be to bring attention to the topic and to insert the issue of human mobility, linking it to the climate. So, and this will probably be also inserted in the conclusions. So I think this is a topic which will have a much more attention, but there will be a big effort to be done. As Ambassador Mistretta mentioned, he quoted Prime Minister Draghi, and I saw his intervention. He said, there is no time. There is no time. We are already very late. There is no time. We saw a large mass of public opinions, youth movements mentioning the topic, but I think it's the state. The states have to take up the responsibility, because also big regional or international organization can raise the attention, but then the biggest part is with the states. So for me, this is the conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. There is no time, but we are in time with our meeting, because we are perfectly in 1 hour and a half, so we closed. So thank you to stick to the time. Thank you to the speakers. I think we had a very fruitful morning with very interesting intervention, and thank you to the Italian Geographical Society. Thank you, Filippo, for hosting us, and thank you to diplomacy. I see now Dottoressa D'Amato is with us. Thank you for coordinating us, and thank you, of course, to the audience here and to the remote connection. Thank you all. Have a good day.